that has made it possible. The recording makes it possible for the videos to be viewed later, and certainly there's a supply of those now on the NENA, the New Economy Network webpage, where much of this material is hosted. So some really great videos from earlier sessions. I guess it is now just after 7. It will be, it seems like a good time to just do some basic beginnings, a little bit of housekeeping, and then sort of set the scene for this evening. So I guess the session tonight is being hosted by the University of Newcastle Quality of Life Project, which Hamed will explain in a minute, and the New Economy Network within Australia. We have 3 speakers, Milena Buchs, Nûjîn, Derya, and my apologies, I lost my names there, Ajahn Brahmali. I hope I've said that correctly. Yeah, so we're looking forward to this. My name's Chris. I'm a lecturer in human services at University of Newcastle. And I'm situated on the central coast of New South Wales, which is dark and young country. And I acknowledge the sort of the elders, past, present, and emerging through this area. We have the great fortune of connecting with the community here, of learning and working together, of educating some of the young people from this community, as well as running some really fantastic projects with the community and really learning together. And I feel very fortunate to sort of be sharing this land with these communities. And so from wherever you're joining us in Australia or around the world, thank you for joining us. If you'd like to let us know where you're joining from in the chat, that's a wonderful thing, and it's always lovely to see that. Just to let you know, we are recording tonight's session. We would ask that if you have questions, please post them in the chat, but we will hold off answering the questions until the very end, just to allow the speakers to flow through from one to the next. And then we'll sort of have a facilitated conversation at the end. I think that's most of the things I needed to do in terms of housekeeping. Please do hold microphones off during the sessions, and that will just help sort of smooth sailing as we go along. So could I ask Hamed you to take a minute and describe the project, or sort of introduce the project that this seminar is part of?
Yeah, okay, thank you so much, Chris. I'll try to make it as brief as I can, because I've done it a number of times through the past sessions. Yeah, that's the screen. And yeah, I wish to also welcome you all and welcome our great presenters, our speakers to our session from the UK, from Syria, and from Perth. You're all welcome. Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you for sharing your knowledge and experience and your views, especially on the topic, which is quality of life, and trying to reimagine it in the current context, which is a very kind of a troubled context. So I also wish to, on behalf of my team, because we're from, my name is Hosseini. I'm a sociologist from the University of Newcastle, and most of us are located in Newcastle, Australia. I wish to welcome you to and acknowledge the Awabakal and Oromo peoples, the traditional owners and custodians of the land on which we work. Their sovereignty has never been ceded. It always was and always will be Aboriginal land. Okay. Yes, this is the 6th webinar that we are offering in 2021. I should say, unfortunately, the last one, because we were looking forward to have another one in November to wrap up, but as the result of the lockdowns and slowdowns, the project has been slowed down, and we decided to actually move the last presentation or last webinar or session to early next year. So this is a part of a webinar series under the general title of Reimagining Quality of Life. And if you look at the list of the sessions, you can watch it on, and I'll share the link to where you can actually have access to the recordings of it on YouTube. The recordings of the past sessions, and including this one after it's being recorded and shared. It's part of a series, and every time we of course invite a group of people, three presenters from different perspectives. So it started from June. It's part of a project that we run in partnership with New Economy Network Australia. And it's a monthly webinar series that brings together activists, intellectuals, academics from a diverse range of perspectives and experiences to present and discuss their alternative views on quality of life. Unfortunately, Michelle, the director of the NENA, couldn't be with us, so I'm taking advantage of my membership in NENA, and I'm now wearing another hat. Just very briefly to introduce that NENA is a non-for-profit network, is a cooperative, and it brings individual and organizations together in order to create multiple shared platforms around different areas of social change, it has the purpose of pushing for change towards new economies and new societies that are more sustainable, more just, and more inclusive. So I would like to invite you to look at the New Economy Network Australia website. I will share the links on the chat room with you very shortly. Again, as I said before, the webinar series is not the only thing that we do. It's again part of a bigger project that includes a social survey, a national social survey that we were about to close. We had a pretty good number of participants finally. This is a pilot project, and also we are about to start our interviewing some of the participants in the survey. Again, it's all about creating finally a platform to influence the discourses of quality of life in this country and beyond, especially beyond the so-called conventional wisdom shared or expressed by politicians, the pundits, and even some of us, the academics. So its Reimagining Quality of Life project aims to play an important part in articulating, connecting, and strengthening the remarkable transformative work being carried out by people and organization across the emerging ecosystem of transformative actors in Australia. I wish to, again, just to cut it short, I wish you to invite you to have a look at our web pages, both on New Economy Network Australia website, but also on the university website, University of Newcastle website. You can see a description of and some more details and a lengthier, longer description of the projects and the list of our members who are involved. We are also very thankful to our undergraduate and postgraduate candidates and students who have contributed to this project as well. We also run a common alternatives website outside the university website. This is much easier for us to update, especially if you're interested in the news from the university side of the project and beyond. I would like to invite you to subscribe to Common Alternatives website. Again, a link will be shared with you soon. And finally, I will share with you a link to a survey. There is an online survey designed by New Economy Network, also the other research hub of the network, to invite people to share their views. So we don't want just to be the speakers, we also want to hear from you. But because of the limited resources and time, we have designed a multiple choice kind of questionnaire, which is not too lengthy, and it would be good to hear from you guys, the participants in our webinars. So a link to this will also be put on the chat room and will be sent by email to you together with the link to the recordings of this webinar. I'm sorry I talked too much. I hope I have left time for our speakers. Okay, that's enough for me. Back to you. I should have stopped sharing.
Thank you, Hamed. That's fantastic. And I think, I guess the scale of the project and the things that you're sort of achieving through the work that's being done through this project is really fantastic and really quite inspiring. And sort of the next phase, I guess, is bringing together so much of the research that's been done and sort of making some findings from that. So it's a really, great project. I guess to step into this evening's presentation, I'd just like to introduce Dr. Milena Buchs, and who's an associate professor in sustainability, economics, and low carbon transitions at the School of Earth and Environment at the University of Leeds. With a background in sociology and political science, current research focuses on climate change and inequality, fair climate policies, and sustainable welfare. Milena has led and collaborated on several major interdisciplinary UK research and innovation grants, including on the current UK Centre for Research into Energy Demand Solutions. Prior to joining the Leeds University, Milena was lecturing at the University of Southampton in sociology and social policy. So it's my great pleasure to welcome you this evening. Thank you for joining us from the UK, where it's the totally opposite end of the day. And the presentation this evening is From the Growth Welfare Nexus to Sustainable Welfare Within Planetary Boundaries. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Chris and Hamed, for hosting this. And thank you so much for the invitation. I'm very excited to be part of the seminar. Thanks everyone for joining. So I just upload my slides. Give me one moment. Right, can you see the slides? Yes, great. I see a thumbs up there. That's fantastic. Yeah, so I wanted to talk about a specific aspect, I suppose, of reimagining the quality of life, which is really about the welfare state and how we can rethink the welfare state, which obviously contributes to our quality of life, at least it is supposed to do so, and how we can reimagine this in a context without economic growth. So the background to this kind of thinking, I guess, is probably clear to everyone here in the seminar, that we have an increasing and worsening ecological emergency with increasing climate change impacts and other environmental problems across the world, including biodiversity crisis, which we very urgently need to fix to make sure that the planet remains livable for future generations. And at the same time, more and more scholars and activists point out the problems with economic growth, of course. I'm sure this has been covered probably in your seminar before, so I will only really briefly actually talk about these problems with economic growth, which are not only that economic systems that are based around growth tend to be exploitative systems that increase inequality. That's one dimension. And the other dimension is, of course, comes from an environmental perspective, that we do not currently see an absolute decoupling of economic growth from and environmental impacts. So just to illustrate this really briefly, what we see when we normalize GDP growth, the material footprint, this is the green line, and CO2 emissions over time, we see that all of them have been increasing over time, except from where we see sort of big, economic crises, global sort of crises. What we see here is relative decoupling. So the gap between them increases, which means that, for example, the CO2 intensity of growth is declining, but we do not see absolute decoupling, which would be a decrease of emissions or the material footprint while GDP is increasing. And that is what we would need to see. We would need to see absolute decoupling at the global level to be able to say we could continue with GDP growth while we fix the ecological emergency. So the question arising from that is, can we speed up technological development to basically lead to this sort of absolute decoupling? But the evidence for that is fairly slim at the moment. If we look at the development of, for example, CO2 intensity per dollar of world GDP, which is a good indicator for technological development, we can see that this CO2 intensity has declined by about 1.1% per year since 1960. But what we would need it to be so that we are able to remain within the global carbon budget and to achieve net zero before 2050, we would basically need a decline of 8.7% per year. So this looks quite unlikely given the current developments in technological innovation. And so this is why many scholars now and activists argue that based on the precautionary principle, we should aim to decouple our economic systems and also welfare systems from GDP growth, and certainly in the global north. So this is then why in this talk I want to briefly outline what these dependencies are between growth in the welfare state, and then talk about how we can move to a sustainable welfare system beyond economic growth. So the dependency between the welfare state and growth is really a mutual one. And it can be quite nicely illustrated, I think, by what Gunnar Myrdal called the virtuous circle in the 1950s. So this sounds a bit outdated, but I think this sort of thinking is still behind lots of politicians and economists and, yes, like you say, academics, ways of thinking about economic growth. And so according to this virtuous circle, economic growth basically creates more employment. That then creates an increase in welfare revenues because people pay more taxes and social insurance contributions. And because it supports the welfare state, so growth leads to an expansion of the welfare state because of all of this. Actually, a bigger welfare state supports things like consumer demand, and that supports economic growth. So in other words, the welfare state actually itself contributes to economic growth and supports it. And it also does that because the welfare state improves, or at least means to improve, people's health and education. And so that makes people more productive. And of course, greater productivity again feeds into greater economic growth. And finally, also this whole process of more revenue for the welfare state, etc., that is meant to decrease poverty and decrease inequality. So this is, according to Gunnar Myrdal, this virtuous circle of economic growth and the welfare state. The flip side of that is that many people argue this makes welfare states currently dependent on economic growth, because if there's no growth in the current context, we see falling employment, rising inequality, and so on. And that is true. However, I want to challenge this type of thinking about the dependency of welfare states on economic growth by asking first, does economic growth actually still deliver these positive outcomes that Myrdal and many others identified earlier, and whether we still see this virtuous circle. So when we look at this question, whether growth still delivers, I think we can point to a range of different things here, and the list on this slide is in no way exhaustive. I'm just giving you some examples here. where we can basically argue that growth no longer delivers these outcomes that the welfare state is meant to have, and that growth is meant to have. The first 3 points on the slide actually come from an OECD report, which is called Beyond Growth. So it's interesting to see that even quite established and mainstream economic institutions are now starting to question growth. So basically in this report, the OECD argues that we are seeing rising income and wealth inequalities, and we have seen this over the recent decade, that in most developed countries, we see an increase in underemployment and insecure and precarious work, and that these sorts of rising inequalities have contributed in many countries to political conflict and instability. So basically almost the opposite of, what the virtuous circle of economic growth promises. We also see falling life expectancies in the US and the UK. So economic growth no longer contributes to rising life to rising life expectancies in some of the rich countries. And then the last 2 points on this slide are really about the impact of prioritizing growth politically, and the ways in which the growth prioritization is often used politically to actually dismantle the welfare state. So this quote here comes from a book edited by Anke Hassel and Bruno Palier, which is about growth regimes in developed welfare states. And in the last chapter of this book, they conclude that changes in welfare systems that are made in the name of growth strategy have left large groups of the electorate less protected than before and forced them into insecure jobs. So in other words, they argue that the prioritization of growth, or the growth imperative, as you could say, is often used by politicians to justify cuts in welfare spending, to justify deregulation, and so on. So this is partly why I would like to put forward an alternative interpretation of this relationship between growth and the welfare state, and propose that we are possibly now moving from a virtuous circle to a vicious spiral, where economic growth basically contributes to the deterioration of social and environmental conditions, which then creates greater demand for welfare, which then creates more pressure again for economic growth. So in other words, yes, we see this sort of dependency there between growth and the welfare state, but not in a positive sense. Yeah. And so this is the spiral in a little bit more detail, where economic growth, it contributes to rising inequalities. And so more growth is then required, or more growth is being argued for, so that wealth can, increased living standards can trickle down to those who are disadvantaged in society. Economic growth also creates higher levels of debt, which then again generates the need for more economic growth so that we can pay back the interest of the debt in the future. Economic growth, of course, increases productivity, and because of this and because of globalization, this puts pressure on labor markets, which again requires more economic growth so that we don't reduce employment. Yeah. Also in a context where people's wages are not high enough so that they have to work more and more to sustain themselves and their families. Basically, people have less time for socially useful activities, and that actually can lead to a marketization of social relationships. So a lot of the services sector is basically a marketization of social relationships, and that in itself obviously is good for economic growth, but it's not necessarily something positive for society. Research by people like Wilkinson and Pickett, the spirit level, which probably you're familiar with, has highlighted that increasing competition and stress in societies leads to higher levels of health inequality and social problems, which then again creates more demand for welfare and hence economic growth, because we need the resources to deal with these problems. And like I said, also economic growth, if it is true that there is this coupling between economic growth and environmental impacts, that actually leads to growth, increases environmental impacts, that then has impacts on health and the economy in negative ways, because, you know, we see infrastructures being damaged, we see air pollution, which affects people's health and so on. So more growth is then required to deal with these problems. And then finally, increasing political distrust and disengagement, which comes from all these sort of social problems and environmental problems, could create a demand for more growth, because the thinking here is that growth provides compensatory consumption. So it enables people to engage in mass consumption, consumerism, and that basically prevents people from protesting and rebelling. So, so the main argument from this section really is that there are certain conditions for the growth dependency of welfare states, and they are primarily inequality, unemployment, debt, and public dissatisfaction. And what I want to argue here is that the drive for economic growth, so the political prioritization of economic growth, actually constantly feeds these conditions for growth dependency. And especially so in the context of deregulation, privatization, and so on. And so basically the argument here is that growth dependencies do not just exist. There's no law that says, you know, that the welfare state is dependent on economic growth. But I think it's much better to see this as that the growth dependencies are something that we create through the institutional setup of our economy. And if that is true, then I think we can argue that growth dependencies can be addressed through policies by creating alternative institutions and alternative economic systems. And so this is how I then want to talk about how we can move to a sustainable welfare system beyond growth, and want to propose here 3 key steps for doing so. The first is that we need to deprioritize economic growth and prioritize social and environmental outcomes, certainly in the global north. Second, that we need to address the conditions of growth dependency, and mainly inequality and unemployment, and that we need to integrate climate and social policies. So we'll expand on each of these briefly before I then close. So the reprioritization of political and economic goals is very much inspired by thinkers like Kate Raworth and her donut, where she argues that we need to create economies and economic practices that enable us to move into what she calls the safe and just space for humanity, which basically respects ecological boundaries on the outside of the donut, but also ensures that we fulfill the social foundations of the economy, which means that we enable everyone in society to fulfill their basic human needs. I also put forward in a recent publication 4 criteria for sustainable welfare. And I argue there that systems that respect planetary boundaries, that again fulfill or enable need satisfaction for everyone, that enable a fair distribution of resources and opportunities, and systems that are democratically governed at all levels. So it could be national level and subnational level policy making, but also at the organizational level, that systems like that could be called sustainable welfare systems. What would that mean more practically? So prioritizing social and environmental goals, first of all, means that we need different measures of social and economic performance. Simon Kuznets, who has invented GDP as a measure, warned himself that GDP is not actually a suitable measure of social progress. And luckily, there are now a whole range of alternative measures of performance available that policymakers could use to measure social and economic performance. So things like the genuine progress indicator, or approaches that basically use a whole range of different social and environmental indicators could be used as an alternative to GDP to measure how our economies and societies are faring. However, we need to move beyond just measuring. We also need to embed the prioritization of social and environmental outcomes in policymaking itself. I think the good news here is that some governments are already moving into this direction. So there's this group of governments called the Wellbeing Economy Governments. I'm sure you've already heard of them, which currently include New Zealand, Iceland, Finland, Scotland, and Wales. Admittedly, 2 of them are subnational governments, but nevertheless. And they have clubbed together, supported by the Wellbeing Economy Alliance, to collaborate to deliver human and ecological well-being. So basically, the leaders of these governments, coincidentally, 4 of them are currently led by women, subscribe to this idea that we need to prioritize social and environmental outcomes over GDP growth. And they have set up measuring systems, evaluation systems to actually do that. So this is quite exciting, I think, and certainly a space to watch. It's really important to highlight as well that this sort of prioritization of social and environmental goals not only needs to happen at the level of policy making, but also at the level of organizations and businesses. So in other words, the profit motive basically needs to disappear as the main objective for businesses. And instead, businesses should subscribe to contributing to social and environmental objectives too. So this should be their priority and not the growth of profit. So second, in this list of how we can move to a sustainable welfare system or sustainable welfare systems, because they will be, organized in different ways across the world, is this idea that we need to tackle the conditions of growth dependency more actively through political intervention. So just 2 examples here related to unemployment and inequality. And the first on unemployment, there's quite interesting modeling work, for example, by Peter Victor and Tim Jackson, and also contributions by Simon Mayer and others that argue that we can keep employment stable without economic growth if we reduce productivity increases. And so one way how we can do this is basically to expand economic sectors that are in a way quite work intensive, but are also difficult to rationalize through technology. So sectors like the social and healthcare sector, the cultural sector, ecological conservation, and sectors like that, which are also beneficial for society and for the environment. And then secondly, tackling inequality. So it's not good enough to tackle inequality through economic growth and trickle down. Trickle down just simply doesn't work. And what we need to do in a context without economic growth is basically to actively intervene and redistribute resources. So we need a much more progressive system of income taxation. We need higher taxes on capital, capital gains, land, property, inheritance. We also need to reduce opportunities for private rent extraction. And there's a brilliant article, which I warmly recommend everyone to read, by Beth Stratford, recently published in Ecological Economics, where she makes that argument about the importance of reducing rent extraction in an economic context without economic growth. So she defines rents as awards for the control over monopolized assets. And so monopolized assets can be a range of different things, including property, land, financial and physical capital, but also things like energy and transport infrastructures, and even things like knowledge. So yeah, and she argues that we can prevent that if we prevent the formation of such monopolies, and if we socialize rents from some of these natural monopolies, such as energy, transport, and water infrastructures, that can help to basically reduce private rent extraction and hence the inequalities that we currently see across the world from these sorts of processes. So, and then finally, really, this point about integrating climate and social policy. So sadly, some climate policies have quite regressive impacts in the sense that they burden low-income households and disadvantaged households more than rich households and privileged households or individuals. So one example for this are carbon taxes on necessity. And here on this graph, you see the results from some of the modeling that I've done based on the European Household Budget Survey, which has expenditure data, and then I, applied a €50 per tax per ton of CO2 to this expenditure and calculated the tax burdens across different income quintiles. And basically, we can see if we express the tax burden as a multiple of the tax burden that is paid by the richest, by the fifth income quintile, we can see that taxes on necessities like home energy are really the most regressive type of tax. So low-income households are disproportionately burdened by taxes like that. Taxes on transport are a little bit more even, and that is mainly because poorer households are still less likely to own a car in the first place, for example, and are also less likely to take part in public transport and fly. So the only tax that is really progressive in distributional terms is a tax on flights, and especially frequent flights here. So this is one problem, and there are other examples of how climate policies can often disadvantage, can burden disadvantaged groups. And so basically we need to develop systems that compensate disadvantaged people and individuals for regressive effects. This can be through tax rebates, by providing free green services, like providing people with free green electricity, for example, or free public transport. We also need to build welfare systems that provide support for climate change resilience, again, sort of prioritizing disadvantaged people. So welfare states would need to provide compensation for climate change impacts, like the impacts of flooding or fires or extreme weather events. And Frank Nullmeier has proposed such a compensation scheme as a new insurance pillar for welfare states, which is quite an interesting idea, I think. The welfare states, more broadly speaking, if you include employment relations and so on in the concept of welfare state, then you can argue that welfare states need to provide or work towards more just transition processes that support workers in high carbon sectors. Because obviously we need to make sure that people who are currently employed in these high carbon sectors, that they can reskill, that they can get new jobs basically. And we also need to ensure that jobs in green sectors are actually well-paid jobs and high-quality jobs, which isn't necessarily always the case. And finally, we need to subsidize green technologies for low-income groups. So, for example, the poorest in society, this might less be a matter maybe for very hot countries, but in colder countries like the UK or Northern Europe, you need to insulate your home, and so low-income households are often not able to afford home insulation or things like solar panels or electric vehicles. So they need to be supported to actually take up these sorts of options for green living. And so that leads me to my conclusions. So I try to make 3 arguments here in this presentation. First, this argument that based on the precautionary principle, which means that we do not know whether we can decouple growth and environmental impacts, and that currently it looks unlikely that we're able to do so. So based on the precautionary principle, it would be prudent to build economies and welfare states that do not depend on economic growth. I also argued that growth dependencies are nothing inherent in welfare states, but that these growth dependencies are created by the current capitalist and growth dependent economic system. So basically by the institutions, policies and practices that we currently engage in. And it follows from that argument that growth dependencies can be addressed through active policy making. And then finally, I argued that we need to repurpose welfare states. So currently welfare states, because they're embedded in growth dominated economic systems, they actually aim to support economic growth. But we need to reverse this and basically need to design welfare states so that they don't aim at economic growth, but directly increase societal and environmental well-being. And finally, welfare states need to be built so that they support a transition to a low carbon economy in a fair way. And this is where I'm going to end. So thank you so much for listening. I'm very much looking forward to your questions and the discussion afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you, Milena. That's fantastic. I think the scale and the breadth of what you covered there was wonderful. And I think the kind of the visuals that you used and the vicious the virtuous circle and the vicious cycle, were really kind of fantastic illustrative ideas. Are really, really beautiful. Thank you so much. And I'm sure, yeah, people will post and we'll see how we go. Thank you. So I'd like to introduce our second speaker, please, Nûjîn Derya. Nûjîn is a member of the Andrea Institute of Jineology Academy based in Rojava in North and East Syria, and I apologize for my pronunciation. The Andrea Institute aims to connect women's knowledge and struggles that are rooted in different regions of the world on the basis of Jineoloji, the science of women that has been developed by the Kurdish women's liberation movement. As internationalist, Nûjîn lived and worked in the women's village of Jinwa for more than 2 years, where women are resisting to war, violence and oppression by developing communal life on the basis of women's liberation, ecology and democratic self-organization. Nûjîn's presentation this evening is titled Liberating Life on Women's Knowledge, Social Organizing and Our Common Struggle, Learnings from the Kurdish Women's Liberation Movement. Thank you and welcome, and looking forward to your presentation.
Yeah, hello from here as well. It's very exciting, and it's an honor actually to participate in this discussion. I also saw that there's someone also from the Federation of Democratic Kurdish Society of Australia present in the talk. So yeah, maybe we can share also more about the reality of Kurdish struggle also in other parts of the world. And yeah, basically it's very interesting because I have the impression that we have many different layers that we are speaking about, no? And that related to this question of what actually means good life, what means well-being. Yes, also thanks to the first presentation. And what we can maybe say, like this question of like what actually is a good life, like what means well-being, how to live, is very essential for us here, and is very essential in the Kurdish liberation movement, of course, because this question basically forms the core of any liberation struggle. No, like we fight for something, we fight actually for a good life, we fight for a free life. And of course, then to ask the question of what means this free life? What means this good life? What is the well-being of society, for example? What to do, where to start, how to live, is very much at the core of all this struggle. And so, because I don't know how much the context here is known, so I want to start with a short introduction in the place where we are here. So, as mentioned before, I'm part of the Andrea Institute of Jineology Academy, which is based in the territory of the Autonomous Administration of North and East Syria. And so like the place here is a place where women from different regions of the world are living and working together with the local women's movement, Kurdish women, Arabic women, and yeah, so somehow it's a place where we exchange knowledge, where we work on different topics related to social liberation, liberation of society, like different movements, also like bringing together the knowledges, the experiences from different movements, also from different parts of the world, with the aim to develop common strategies, to develop a common understanding also of what we are actually facing, like what is the problem right now in this global like situation of crisis that we are actually fearing, like what are the social problems, what like economic problems, how do we like where we see the root of this, how we analyze it, and how like we can develop actually alternatives in theory and also in practice to deal with this together actually. And yeah, like so this region here is also known under the name Rojava, which means like literally translated it means west in Kurdish. And so it's like the western part of Kurdistan as well. And yeah, as you probably know, like since 1923, through the Treaty of Lausanne, the region that is called Kurdistan has been split by national borders actually. So yeah, these borders, they go completely through like family structures. They go like like split also the territory where Kurdish people are living in, like a part, like a Turkish part, the Iraqi part, the Syrian part, and the part of in Iran. And yeah, so and related to this like drawing of the borders, also like Kurdish people have been facing extinction policies, actually violent assimilation policies in the different states also, like a long history of ban of Kurdish language, ban of Kurdish culture, expression. At the same time also created like a big politicization among many Kurdish people, you know, like coming also to the conclusion of, okay, like Kurdistan is actually a colony, you know, like it's being used as a as a place to like take out resources, for example, labor force, but not giving actually like political like representation to the people. So also like the struggle of Kurdish people against all these forms of oppression has a very long history. And yeah, maybe one thing important to mention also, like there's like Abdullah Öcalan, which maybe many people also might have heard about, who's kind of like the main thinker, philosopher, and also like political leader of the Kurdish liberation movement. And in 1999, he has been captured by like a kind of coordinated action of different states and secret services. And since then, he's imprisoned and actually in solitary confinement, which is of course a big injustice also. And actually, like he phrased a lot of things that have been discussed in the Kurdish liberation movement. And so like about the topics of actually like what means like a struggle for liberation, what means a just world, and how like what it actually needs to develop like a free society. And like one other very important aspect that like within the Kurdish liberation movement, like women's liberation plays a very, very important role. So like the liberation movement is not only against colonialism, is not only like for like generally the dignity of the people or political representation, but like the clue is this understanding that it actually needs a very deep change of the mentality. It needs like really to overcome all the kind of forms of oppression that like as people we have inside ourselves, like due to the way how we grew up, for example, that we have in our minds, in our hearts, in the forms like how we are actually relating to each other. and like how we are relating to other people, how we relate like with society in general, with nature, with the land, with even with time, because like how do we understand ourselves in time also, no? Like, are we aware of our history or not? And how do we consider like how do we form our identity also? And on the other hand, it needs to overcome actually like this like kind of centralized state, and the state as a form of governance also. So so we can say that, for example, like on the base of all the experiences that have been made in like the liberation struggle in Kurdistan, but also like analyzing like different struggles for national liberation of these times, wars for independence, also like the failed attempts of real socialism, for example, like drawing conclusions from this, like we come to this point of actually seeing that the goal of any like anti-colonial movement, any anti-imperial struggle cannot be to only build up an own state, independent state, for example. No, but actually the thing is that like this whole logic and way of organizing of a state has to be overcome, because we see that like throughout history, actually like certain forms of state organizing actually like continue to reproduce oppression, for example. So and instead of like so much focusing on this concept of state, it needs actually like a redefinition of the social relations. It needs a redefinition of politics, actually. So what means politics, basically, no? And like kind of bringing politics also back to to its source, to its origin, no? So it's actually a social process. It's like a social process of decision making. It's related to the needs of people in like in the communities, but also in like bigger societies and also globally, no? And so this is very very important, and in this sense also like to get away of this logic of like bureaucracy, this logic of like profit and maximum exploitation, for example, that has been also mentioned in the first presentation, for example. And actually this has been kind of like a new paradigm also of the Kurdish liberation movement that has been phrased by Abdullah Öcalan, so like one very very crucial concept in this is like a democratic confederalism, and this maybe like some of you also have heard this already. But so like is actually the idea of like the self-organization of society in general. Like it's very basic, actually. It's and it has in different parts of the world also like the same tradition has maybe appeared also with different names, for example. So what it means. So it's not kind of a new universal, but like it's it applies to the capacity of people actually to self-organize, the capacity of people to develop methods, to develop mechanisms locally and globally. And it's based on like three main pillars, which is one like the democratic society, like the democratic self-administration of the people. Then it's based on women's liberation, gender liberation. No, it like women's liberation also means like the liberation of men, for example, no, like, or general gender liberation, because it's kind of overcoming the like gender related forms of oppression. And the third pillar is ecology, actually. So these three pillars are like in the core of this concept of democratic confederalism. And then like there's a whole like range of different methods, for example, forms of organizing, like from decision making in assemblies and councils, through reorganization of economy, like with the base of like cooperatives, for example, reorganization of education with like people's academies, for example. So but it's like in general, it's putting like somehow the decision making like back to the people, actually. And so this is one important maybe theoretical base, philosophical base also, And then shortly to say for Rojava, because I see the time is running a bit. Yeah, I don't know how much the history also of this part here is like so known. So actually, like also in this region, of course, like people have been organizing a lot. Here has been like the Syrian state very dominant with a lot of policies, also like not acknowledging like Kurdish people's rights, for example, but also like this was much bigger, you know, like. And yeah, so like and then since like 2011 2012 like the resistance of the people here also took another stage somehow, no? So all this framework of Arabic Spring in different regions around Syria also, and the uprisings against the Syrian Ba'ath regime, like kind of gave space also for a revolutionary process, like here in the north and east of Syria to develop. So, like in this region where Kurdish people are also the majority, so there have been also a lot of uprisings in this time, no? And then like yeah, kind of in connection to this, in connection also to like fights that were going on, there was like the opportunity for the people actually to make a revolution, no? Like which is known also as the Rojava Revolution globally. And yeah, so to push out and to develop own structures of people's self-administration. And like this is starting from people organizing in communes, in councils. It's based also on like the equal representation of ethnicities, of like different religions, religious backgrounds, of different identities. And it's giving a lot of importance also to the representation of like religious and ethnic minorities, because like actually Kurdish people have faced this so much to be the minority themselves, for example. So like this has been like put like directly to the social contract of like this new kind of people's self-administration, like to yeah, like kind of to like to always guard also like the equal, like the representation of all the minorities also. And yeah, and also on the basis of gender liberation. And lots of people maybe heard about the YPJ, like the women self-defense forces that played a very big role in the struggle against like ISIS, that like the region for the last, like for quite an amount of time now. And but like women have taken really big role in like developing this revolution actually, and play until the present day. So like women on the one hand being present in the like in the armed defense against the attacks of ISIS, but like on the other hand, like building actually alternatives in all fields of society. So like women build their own councils, build academies, build like a lot of different like cooperatives, a lot of different social like forms of social organization also. And at the same time, there is a few mechanisms that also like are related to this like gender liberation struggle. So for example, there's this kind of co-chair system in all like political also let's say institutions. And so there's always ability being speakers, for example, like this, yeah, as a co-chair. And yeah, and seeing this also as one of mechanisms to
I'm very sorry, Nûjîn, but we've entirely lost your sound at our end. So I want to say to everyone, and I will communicate with Nûjîn again, having this wonderful technology that's kind of allowed us to travel the world tonight and have people from all different places, sometimes also has glitches as well. So bear with us for a second while I am.
Yes, and Nûjîn is from Syria, and I can imagine that the quality is not that good. I guess, yeah.
Yeah. So what I might do in a second while I try to reach Nûjîn. Oh dear, it's very hard. I apologize. And obviously Nûjîn can't hear us at her end either, which is kind of unfortunate. So yes, just bear with us for a second. So what I might need to do, I might need to send a different message. I'm wondering, Hamed, if you would try to connect with Nûjîn and let her know. And if it's okay, what I might need to do is introduce our final speaker for the moment, if that's okay, if that sounds all right, Ajahn Brahmali. And Ajahn was born in Norway in 1964 and became interested in Buddhism and meditation in his early 20s whilst on a visit to Japan. After hearing teachers from Ajahn Brahm, he decided to travel to Australia and train at Bodhinyaya, and I apologize for the pronunciation, monastery, where he took full ordination in 1996 with Ajahn Brahm as his preceptor. In 2021 is Ajahn 26th year as a Buddhist monk. Ajahn Brahmali is renowned for his excellent knowledge of the Pali language, which is Sanskrit, and his enthusiasm for teaching the discourses of the Buddha. He's also well known as a scholar of the Vinaya, the monastic rules and procedures, which he is currently translating into English. Ajahn Brahmali's clear and insightful talks help make the Buddha's teachings accessible to all. He is regularly invited to conduct retreats in Australia, Southeast Asia, Sri Lanka, and Europe. Ajahn Brahmali has also published numerous essays on important points of Dharma, including the legitimacy of the ordination of Buddhist nuns, of which he is a supporter. And Ajahn talk tonight is on the Buddhist idea of a good life. So welcome, Ajahn. We look forward to hearing your material.
Great. Thank you so much, Chris. And thank you for having me here. And it's nice to be able to meet you all. This is quite likely to be quite a different kind of talk from what we heard before, because this is going to be more from a, if you like, a spiritual point of view. And what I want to do is look at some of the foundational problems that you often find in society that are the cause of all these kind of inequalities, both internal for individuals, but also for society as a whole. So am I able to share my screen, Chris? Is that going to be all right?
Yes. Do you have the button there available?
I think I do. Let's see what happens. It's not, doesn't seem to happen. Okay, yeah, let's see. Okay, here we are, yeah. Okay, so here we go. So this is going to be about the Buddhist idea of the good life. And the strange thing about the Buddhist teachings, these are teachings that are 2,500 years old, and they are kind of coming into force again 2,500 years later. One might wonder what the relevance of these teachings are to the modern era, whether it's here in Australia or Europe or indeed anywhere in the world. But actually, they are becoming quite taken up by more and more people around the world, which is very fascinating. And so I'll have a very quick look at why these Buddhist teachings are being regarded as so interesting. I want to just very briefly focus on two main issues that seem to be very relevant for modern people. So what is this thing about Buddhism that makes it so relevant? About the Buddhist teachings, which differentiate religion, spiritual teachings. I'm not even sure if we should call it a religion. That in a second, is that Buddhist teachings are basically formulated around universal principles. In other words, ideas about how the mind operates, ideas about how to live your life, to have good outcomes, and these kind of things. They are about and their relationship to reasons for religion. It's really about the discovery of the nature of the world and the nature of how the world functions. Because it is around universal principles. This is one of the reasons why even in the contemporary society. The second aspect about Buddhism is the following. Very often Buddhism, you will
okay, it seems that the gods are all against us.
Thank you, Ahmed. I was just checking to see if it was
okay, right.
Is there possibly some static at your end, Ajahn?
Static? Okay. I can just take it down a little bit.
There could be something there.
Yeah. Any better?
Yes.
I'm not sure if yeah.
Would the microphone of the computer better than this? It seems that it has some these connections happening.
I'm not sure if I'm able to fix that at the moment. It's going to be hard for me.
Is it possible to hold it with your hand?
Does that help?
Hopefully.
Yeah.
Yes,
okay. I'll try
helpful.
this and see what happens. Okay. Very good. Okay. So thank you for what I'm saying is that.
Unfortunately, it's not helping. Is there maybe disconnecting it from the laptop or the computer and then using the computers?
I don't. The laptop is a little bit far away. Is it really okay? I'm not sure if what I can.
It's funny. There seems to be moments when it's working very, very well, which is right now.
Okay.
So
can I just carry on? Is that all right? Yeah.
Let's fingers crossed.
Okay, fingers crossed. Okay. So the idea here is that the main purpose of the Buddhist teaching is to develop the mind, is to change your outlook and to look at the world in a new way, and then to develop your mind in a certain direction. So really, as far as I'm concerned, of course, it depends how you use these Buddhist teachings. There are many different ways of using them, but the core way of using this teaching is as a psychology to develop yourself mentally. And so this development, internal development, is then reflected also in society at large, how we organize ourselves. And I want to talk a little bit more about how we organize things in the Buddhist teachings, because it really is a result of the underlying principles and the underlying psychological outlook that we have from these Buddhist teachings. So this is what it is about. And so because it is about psychology, it means that the underlying problems that we find, both for individuals, but also for society as a whole, are really of a psychological nature. So let's have a look at these things. What are the roots of the social ills in the world, both the personal ills, but also the social ills? And in Buddhism, we talk about three kinds of roots of social ills. And the first one, and the most profound one, is the root that we call delusion, having a misunderstanding of what the world actually is like. And this is very fascinating. It's obviously very relevant to the present day when we have all kinds of fake news, we have conspiracy theories left, right, and center, all of these kind of things. This is actually a very significant issue right now. But it's so obvious when people deny climate change denial and all of these kind of things. But the truth behind this is obviously if you're going to have success in any area, in any kind of field of life, success comes always from seeing the world straight, seeing the world as it actually is. If you don't see the world the way it is, you're going to head down the wrong path. You're going to have the wrong goal. You're going to approach the goal you have in the wrong way because you are deluded about how the world works. And it's very obvious that it has to be this way. When you think about it, it's very obvious that if you approach your project, whatever it is, with the wrong kind of attitude, you're not going to reach the goal that you want to do. If you misunderstand the idea of climate change, and there actually is really difficult things going on, it's going to have very bad consequences down the track. So seeing things straight is very important. I'll come back to the remedies for these things in a second. First of all, I just want to have a quick look at the problems. The second root of all ills in society is the idea of ill will and anger and hatred, and that kind of group of psychological factors that have to do with the desire, if you like, to harm others, which is the root. This is the root for that kind of desire. And it is very obvious, I think, that this leads to tremendous social harm. It leads to social harm in the domestic scene. It leads to social harm in almost any kind of group or organization that we have. And it also leads to harm even internationally in terms of wars and all of these kind of things. So this is a major problem. Then we have the last one of these three. The last one is greed. And I think this is what comes the closest to some of the main issues that we have been talking about. Of too much economic growth driven by the idea of greed. Sometimes even here, you can hear from the capitalist point of view that greed is good. And people...
Okay, we seem to have the same problem again. Ajahn, sorry. I think that microphone is not that helpful.
One is not good. Yeah. Is that help at all, or is it still the same?
Yeah, no, that is much better.
Okay.
It seemed only when you changed something it was working so well, and then suddenly it changed. So
okay, it must be a little bit of disconnection in the wire. And when you play with it, when the position changes, it gets connected. When it changes again, it gets disconnected.
I will try to sit utterly still and not move a micro inch and see what happens. Microcentimeter. Okay, let's try again.
Thank you.
Yeah. So from a Buddhist point of view, greed is highly problematic rather than being the source of economic growth. It actually is the source of a lot of destruction. So let's have a quick look at a couple of reasons why greed is so problematic. Yeah. The first one is that greed does not actually lead to satisfaction. And the idea that people are greedy in the world, it comes down to a intuition that if you follow your greed, if you follow your desires, then down the track, it will actually lead to satisfaction. That is the lie in our minds, the lie in our head, this idea that if we just carry on trying to satisfy our desires, build up our material wealth to a certain point, there comes a point of satisfaction. But actually, it is just a lie. And you can see that in the world. You see people building up massive fortunes or whatever. It doesn't lead to satisfaction at any point. There's always more. There's always a demand for more. And when you own the whole Earth, well, then the next step is to own Mars and Venus and the solar system, and then moving on endlessly like that. There is no limit to human greed. And this is a very important insight, because once you understand that, you understand that the function of the material world really is to have enough to be able to, not to have too little so that you suffer because of deprivation or whatever, but you have sufficient to be able to sustain yourself and then exist in a satisfactory way. That is really the main purpose of the material world. And beyond that, there are other things that actually lead to satisfaction to a far higher degree than the material world. So this is the first problem. It's a very important thing. And I think psychology will largely corroborate the Buddhist insights on this particular point. The second point, which is also very damaging for the idea of greed, is that greed and material desire always goes hand in hand with conflict and violence. Yeah, and the reason for that is very simple when you think about it. There's always limited resources in the world. There's only so much to go around. The pie is only so large. There's only so much to be had. And because greed is infinite and the pie is only limited, it means that whenever we clash against each other through competition, through desiring the same resources, desiring the same things in the world, then conflict is going to arise and violence is going to be a consequence of that. And this is, I think, very devastating argument against greed, because it means that very much of the, what I would call the kind of the basic idea, the capitalist idea that you know, we compete with each other and then we kind of make progress through competition and through creative destruction and these kind of things. Actually, it has a very, very, very serious downside, which is a lot of the conflict and the violence we see in the world actually comes from this. So the question then is there another way for us to actually live rather than through competition and greed, which ultimately leads to so many problems? So let's see at some of the possible solutions to this. I'm going to have to go fast, I can see, so I will do that. So first of all, how do we counter the idea of delusion here? So to do this, one of the most important things is to be able to understand human nature. Yeah, and this is again very much what Buddhist teaching is about. And the understanding of human nature, according to Buddhism, is really to understand that we are very fundamentally conditioned as human beings. Many aspects of many philosophies in the world will argue that there is some essential part of the human being, something essential which can withstand conditioning. If you have a core which is essential, that core will be able to withstand the conditioning of the world. But if you have no core, if everything is conditioning, then the problem of human nature is that we are very affected by external and internal circumstances. So once you understand that, you can understand the power of all these external things, whether it is fake news, conspiracy theories, because we are so led by these things, because there's nothing really inherent inside of us to withstand these pressures from outside. So we need to see human nature in the right way. And then based on that, we can then form policies. And especially, I think, for all of these things, the field of education is going to be of fundamental importance to be able to give rise to a proper understanding of the world. We need a world which is led by, maybe not led by, but where experts have a very important input. I think one of the worrying things about the contemporary world is the denigration of experts, but experts are fundamental for us to be able to understand what is going on. And the sort of things that we have seen in the sphere of climate change, where experts are denigrated and they are kind of, their motives are put into question, all of these kind of things have a terrible consequences for our society. So we need to kind of re-establish the sense of trust in human institutions, and a large part of that, I think, comes through education. And this is where a very large part of fighting delusion comes from. Okay, then we have to counter the idea of anger. And this is again about understanding human nature in the right way, to understand that human nature really is about how conditioned we are. And one of the kind of powerful things about understanding the conditioned nature of human beings is that it gives scope for forgiveness and compassion for the world around us. These things are so important. If we see that our enemy or the person on the opposite side of the political debate, that they are human just like us, but they have been conditioned in a different direction. Because remember, the idea here from a Buddhist point of view is that there is no core to a human being. There's nothing that can withstand the external pressures. And again, this fits very well with ideas in modern psychology, that there is no, there is no soul or anything like that to be found in a human being. And so what that means then, again, is that we have more ability to be compassionate to the world around us, to people around us. This is so important if we're going to have a proper communication, if we're going to be able to persuade each other of what actually is the underlying reality that we have to sort out. So this is a very important part of this. And again, this has to come through, I think, in large part through education, understanding the nature of the human mind. Then there is the idea of inherent goodness in human beings. And by inherent goodness, I don't mean that there is some kind of, firm, fixed principle inside human beings, which is good. But what I mean is that I think there is an intuition in all of us that goodness is a positive thing. We know that if we are good, if we are kind to others, if we are compassionate, if we are generous, we know it leads to our own happiness. And of course, it also leads to the happiness of the other person. And I think that intuition is there, except that very often it is kind of destroyed, or it is somehow made inoperative by external conditions, which make us blind to our own proper understanding of what actually is going on inside of us. The intuition is strong. We just need to kind of bring it back out again. And this too is done very often through education, and very often just by pointing these things out. The moment you see these things, you will tend to recognize them in yourself. So just pointing these things out can be incredibly powerful. Please stop me at any time, Chris, if I've gone too long, because I know that time is very short, but I will just carry on for another couple of minutes until you kind of throw me out, as I say. Yeah.
Certainly, you sort of have a balance of a few minutes for sure, about 3 or 4 minutes.
Great.
We might take this moment just to say that if we can have Nûjîn back for a minute at the end, just to present a couple of key ideas, we might try that.
Okay, great. Yeah. So let's come now to the countering of greed. Yeah, again, the understanding of human nature is very important to be able to do this, to understand that this thing that I was talking about before, that we tend to kind of just carry on endlessly, running after the things of the world in the blind way, without really understanding that there are other things that actually are far more satisfying to the human psyche than the external things. And so what we need to do, we need to turn our understanding around to make people see that these other things actually are far more important. And what it comes down to is really how we treat other people, whether we live in the world with a sense of compassion and kindness. And ultimately, that is far more satisfactory for us as human beings than the pursuit of material things. And this has ultimately a consequence also for how we organize ourselves. Instead of organizing ourselves in endless competitions against each other, it makes more sense to cooperate, because cooperation is a way of helping each other, working together. And actually that ultimately gives a far more satisfactory life than the competitive system that we are so used to in our present world. So these are then the other routes to satisfaction, the routes that go through how we actually relate to other people, essentially. These are these other routes, and they're far more satisfactory in the end. It has to do with then moving from competition to cooperation, because competition always leads to violence. It leads to conflict between people, whereas cooperation actually builds up those inner qualities, those inner mental, spiritual qualities that ultimately lead to real contentment and satisfaction. And then we have this idea that was, I think, it was initially suggested by the small kingdom of Bhutan, this idea of the gross domestic happiness. And this was one of the points, I think, that was mentioned by the previous speaker, Milena Buchs, that there are other ways of measuring our societies rather than just through GDP. And we should get better at actually measuring these other ways, because some of these other happinesses are actually much more significant for human beings than just pure material well-being here. Very briefly, I'm going to just very briefly mention some of the social structuring that we use in the Buddhism, especially within the Buddhist monastic order. We use a type of absolute democracy where everyone has to agree. And this is a very marvelous way of getting everyone on board. It means that no one is left out. There's no tyranny of the majority over the minority. Because everyone has a say, that tyranny of the majority is kind of reduced and actually taken away completely. Then there is the other Buddhist idea which we use, which I think is very important, as the idea of decentralization. And the idea of decentralization is that you reduce some of the pyramids and some of the hierarchies in the world. I believe, and I think this is why, one of the reasons why the Buddha actually established these decentralized structures, is that hierarchies are almost inherently corrupting. They're corrupting because everyone wants to climb the hierarchy. Once you climb the hierarchy, you get more power. When you get more power, you get your things your way. Decentralized structures, by their very nature, have a more egalitarian way and a greater ability to focus on other things than just power and the material world around us. There is more I have, but I'm going to stop there out of compassion for everyone. We're going too late. But so thank you very much, Chris, and back over to you again.
Thank you so much for your presentation. What I really appreciate is that people have taken the real challenge of not just describing the difficulties, but also presenting what some alternatives and what the new, what different structures would look like. We do have Milena only for another minute or so, and then we would love to see if we can get Nûjîn back. But are there any questions for Milena before she needs to depart? Otherwise, I would sort of say, personally, thank you. But yeah, any questions for Milena before she has to depart? Since there isn't one in the chat that's sort of sitting up there that I can see, or a hand up or anything like that, Milena, can I ask, is there a measure that you recommend in terms of these kind of alternative measures of well-being or alternative measures for social improvement?
Yeah, thank you for that question, and thank you to everyone for participating. I'm sorry that I have to leave to another meeting. Feel free to email me if you have questions. I would say a sort of composite indicator would probably be the best one, or indicators, I suppose, so that we do not fall back into the prioritization again of a single, a single measure. So I think if we have a range of different measures that really can look at environmental outcomes, social outcomes, and really a broad range of social outcomes here, including gender equality, ethnicity, etc., I think that is quite a good and promising approach. Yeah.
That makes perfect sense, and that's that really is a great way of seeing it. And I was just thinking of what Nûjîn was saying about the sort of systems of co-design and collaboration, the sort of like co-development of measures as well, perhaps from the ground up. But, yeah. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. And Milena has published recently a book on post-growth and well-being, if I'm not wrong. So I take the advantage of this time before you go to introduce that book. And yeah, if you would like to say something about that, that's.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. Yes, that's right. Yeah, I co-authored a book with Max Koch on post-growth and well-being. And there's also a summary article actually of it in the Journal of Futures, which might be a bit quicker to read. In fact, I could maybe, if I have a second, try to find the link to it. And basically, we sort of pull together thinking on well-being, but also welfare states and how this could be transformed in a post-growth context, but also what the challenges to it are in terms of underlying mental infrastructures and our practices. And so very sort of how very fundamental the change needs to be to make this shift to a post-growth society happen, basically.
Thank you so much. And sorry we didn't have that many people, perhaps because of the timing here in the eastern side of Australia. It's a bit later. But we have a very long list. I assure you about 1,200 more that we can certainly send. We will send the link to them. They have been following the series.
Fantastic. Thank you so much again for the invitation. Yeah, it was brilliant. And thank you to the other speakers as well. I made many notes.
Thank you.
Thanks again.
Thank you very much. So I would say thank you for Ajahn for offering just to kind of hold. And I wondered, Nûjîn, do you have if I could beg everyone's patience for a couple of minutes, just we would really love to hear the sort of the final kind of key points that you are hoping to make. Is that something you would be able to do for a couple of minutes if people are okay to stay for 5 minutes?
Okay.
Can do.
Yeah, thank you very much. I would be glad to summarize some points. I don't know what happened to the sound. Actually, I hope now it's working. But also, I think I stretched a bit maybe also the presentation. So now, really, I try to take out just some like key points, let's say. So I think what can be seen also maybe in the other presentations and like related to like what we are dealing with here, is this thing of, okay, like this question, what means the good life? What means what is a free society? What is well-being in society? Also, it's not a pure technical question, of course. No, it's really very much like a question of meaning also. So like, of course, like on the one hand, there is this what it needs for this well-being is, of course, integrity of the land, integrity of society, for example. Like you cannot develop well-being in occupation, for example. Like you cannot develop well-being when there's like repression, when there's torture, when there's like all this kind of like attacks that are there daily and very present, for example, when we see also like the situation in the region here, for example. But there's this layer, let's say. But on the other hand, there's actually this big question of what meaning do we see in the way how we are living, how we are organizing as society, for example. The way how we actually make relations, how we struggle also, for example. And in Kurdish, there's one saying that is also in the Kurdish liberation movement important base, and it's in Kurdish it's hakikat ashke u ashke jana azade. This means truth is love and love is a free life. It has a very, very deep meaning, actually, because the first thing is that we have to actually reconsider what we see as truth. It's to really question all these big narratives that we are often growing up with, that we are confronted with, and to really go deep at the source of what is knowledge, what is power, and how is it developing. On the other hand, also not fall into this kind of relativism to say, okay, there's no truth, or there's 100,000 of truths, for example, because that can also not be the base for a society to exist, for example. And what we say, for example, is okay, that actually living is a continuous search for truth also. It's something that never stops. It's this okay, we try to understand our roots, we try to understand society, ourselves in society, we try to understand what is actually truth, and it's also related to historical consciousness, for example. It also means to overcome actually this kind of dualisms of mind and body, subject, object, human and nature, for example. We have to really develop this holistic understanding towards life. And so this is one very, very important part, actually, also. And and then also when we say truth is love and love is a free life, then also the question, what means love, actually? When we see love as not only something very romantic, for example, as in some Hollywood movies, for example, or some kind of let's say imagination that somehow keeps things running, but actually love is also a very basic force of social connections, and how can we come back actually to this very basic force of social connections, which means trust, which means mutual support, mutual aid, which means feeling also the other, for example, and also lifting these borders that we put between us and the others, for example, or humans and nature and mind and body, to really transcend this kind of understanding also through actually through love as a core of sociality also, and on the other hand also politicizing this concept, so love is not something love is not this kind of a romantic imagination, for example, or romantic feeling in a moment, but it's really a basic force of connection, actually, and in this sense is also very political, in fact. And then to come to the last point of this truth is love and love is a free life. So like we also have to reconsider what we understand as freedom, basically, no? So like a lot of times we have like this very, very like individual conception of freedom, no? I'm free to, like, I'm free from responsibility, I'm free from a lot of things, for example, but the important question is like what social, like what means like a social form of freedom, actually, you know? Like that cannot be only like following individual desires, for example, all the time, but like there needs to be also like a collective kind of freedom, collective understanding of freedom that also builds on collective desires, and that kind of like finds the balance practically also between like individual freedom and like a collective freedom. So it needs to be one somehow. It cannot, like, one cannot be without the other, actually. So, and this is a very deep and philosophical question, but it's also a very practical question, actually. And it's very interesting because there's the thought in the Buddhist philosophy as well, you know, like how we actually overcome this ego, you know, like how we overcome this. And this means basically how we overcome like this individualism, no? Like, which is very destructive for the world, actually. And yeah, so like the way how like we can develop a good life, the way how we can develop a like free life is also through like coming to this question what freedom means and developing collective understanding of freedom, actually. And this is not something that we can just make like from one day to the other, for example, because this coming to this understanding is already related to a whole like process of coming together, debating, developing common consciousness, for example, you know? And then so this that we have. And then like for this question of, okay, like what it practically also needs then, no, like related to this for this quality life. So yes, it needs like, first of all, this like really going to the roots, really like not trying to solve things in the structures that are already there, no? Like sometimes we really need to, like, we need to think much deeper, no? Like we need to feel much deeper, for example. And the solutions, they also come like out of like this really deep kind of reflections. And like, and on the other hand, it needs then like people's self-organization on all levels of society, no? And so like not actually this kind of state way of organizing from up down, but like really like yeah, coming from the roots of social organizing also, no? Like it can be neighborhood organizing, for example, like building councils, actually, no? Like building like structures of decision making that are like not centralized in the state way, for example, no? But having like this kind of yeah, very much democratic processes. And so, and there's actually a lot of sources of this, no? Like it's something that we see a lot of times, no? Like there's many neighborhood organizing, there's many like different traditions of like this also grassroots organizing and struggle, no? And then so like this is one important thing. Then also finding ways of like organizing together, no? Like finding ways of coordination, finding ways of sharing and so on, like, which can be also like, yeah, this kind of council structure, actually. And then also yeah, actually to acknowledge, of course, like yeah, what it practically means, this what we always say, no? Like, okay, we have the local perspective and we have the global perspective at the same time, no? Like we are acting local, we are struggling locally, but at the same time, like we have the consciousness of how globally actually everything is connected, how like the answers that we need to give in this situation of global crisis need to be also thought and need to be organized also globally. So like this like is really also a very, very crucial point, and this is something that we experience here when like we come as people like from different movements, also from different social contexts, different cultural contexts, and so on. But we see, okay, like we are actually driven by the same question, by the same necessity of acting, and the same necessity of like kind of connecting more these different approaches that we are also having, no? Because yeah, only like this we can really develop something forward. And I think we cannot wait for like state interventions. We cannot wait for like yeah, like solving things in the structures that are there, for example. But we need to develop from, like, we need to develop these alternatives that are also there, that have like a long history, that have deep roots, but like to strengthen these alternatives, to make like to coordinate these alternatives, and like through this, like really develop like like a kind of alternative strength also, that that develops actually this good life, this free life. And this is also something that will never stop. Like it's a whole process, it's a whole path. It's nothing that will be there at some point as a utopia, but it's the current struggle that is there every day actually. And and so we also look for this kind of interaction exactly like now in this kind of seminar. So it's very amazing, like all these moments when we actually exchange about these topics and pose the question of how can we actually connect more our researches, our future perspectives, our methods, and like experiences. So in this sense, like thanks also a lot for this opportunity and this talk, and I'm looking forward for more discussion.
Thank you very much, Nûjîn. We really appreciate you hanging in with us and sort of holding in there and coming back and closing with those points. And I really like the crossover and what sounds to me like some strong parallels with the Buddhist kind of perspectives on a range of different things. And I think what's hard with a seminar like this is we're asking you to wrap up such enormous ideas in a very short space of time, and with even not so much time to talk together. And I would have loved to have heard the conversation between yourself and Ajahn if you had the chance to talk through some of the parallels. We have to close.
Yeah, can I also interrupt and suggest that if our speakers, Ajahn and Nûjîn, have their speeches or presentations in writing, we will be very pleased to get them published in our websites. I'm sure you had to cut a lot of things you wanted to say. So if you have something in writing, we will really appreciate if you could send us those writings. Thank you.
Thank you, Hamed. I was going to ask if you did want to say anything just in closing, just for closing the series and closing tonight. But thanks everyone for your patience. But Hamed, anything you wanted to say in closing? No, sorry. Sorry that I interrupted. I thought that you were just going to end it. So I thought better to make that suggestion and request to our presenters. I don't have much to say. Thank you everyone, and thank you Ajahn, thank you Nûjîn. Thank you, Chris, for hosting. Yeah, look, and the question was asked about holding the discussion, the call open. I'm going to close the recording for a start because I think that's important that we just need to kind of end that.